myself before
Okay.
I got started. So thank you for that very nice introduction. So about 8 years ago, before the pandemic, I was scheduled to give a talk in Orlando. And my talk was as part of a big conference on financial services where people had the chance to go to see different talks at the same time in a series of breakout rooms. So a woman came to my talk on the science of happiness. And at the end of my presentation, she came up to me and said, "Thank you so much. That was great. I'm so glad I came. I really learned a lot. You were wonderful." And then she paused and she looked at me right in the eye and she said, "And I have to be honest, I almost skipped your presentation because I just really figured that I would hate you." And I said, thank you for that unusual compliment. And may I ask why you assumed you'd hate me?" And she said, "Well, I just figured that anyone who talked about the science of happiness would be all about like kittens and rainbows, and you'd just be really irritating. And by the end of the hour, I would want to strangle you. And I don't. So thank you so much." And I'm starting today with that story because it actually really illustrates something important that I'm going to talk about again and again today. There are some people in the world, and I'm sure some people listening to my talk today, who are the kittens and rainbows people who can always find that silver lining no matter what happens. And if you're one of those people, congratulations. And this talk is going to be a wonderful affirmation of all of the things that you are doing very well in your life already. But then there are other people, and I'm actually one of the other people who don't naturally and easily find happiness and who actually have to work for it. So I'm going to be talking today about the science of happiness, about what does and what does not predict happiness. But my very favorite part is about the last 10 minutes in which I am going to give you specific strategies that you can use to feel greater happiness, no matter where you fall on that natural happiness continuum. And none of these are things like sell all your belongings and move to Aruba. They're all things that you can do. But before we get started, I'm actually going to start with a poll question because I always like to know who I am talking to. So I'm going to launch this poll. And if you are participating on your phone, you may not be able to see this and participate, but I'll talk about the answers. This is totally anonymous, but I'll just give you about 10 seconds or so to let me know if you are a kittens and rainbows person or not. You guys are doing a great job. Already half of you have participated. Actually now it's 60% of you. Now it's 70%. Okay, you guys are participating very fast. All right, and we're now up to nearly 80%. So I'm just going to give it like 5 more seconds, and I'm going to pull this poll down. We'll have another couple polls later today, so you'll have other chances. So I'm going to count it down from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I'm going to end the poll. And I'm going to share the results. So look who I'm talking to. About a third of you are the kittens and rainbows people. Congratulations. And about 2/3 of us are actually not those kittens and rainbows people. Okay, so I want to move on though. Before I talk about what does make us happy, and don't worry, I'm going to get there. I want to talk about what we think makes us happy, but we're wrong. And the reality is, if you ask people overwhelmingly, what do they think will make them happy, but they're wrong about, the number one thing people are wrong about, money. Overwhelmingly, people think, if I just had more money, surely I would be happier. This is a picture of Tiger Woods' house, or maybe now it's Tiger Woods' ex-wife's house. But many of us think, if I lived in a house like that, wouldn't I be happier every single minute of every single day? But the reality is, no, that we adjust very quickly to newfound wealth. Initially, if we experience a raise or a lottery windfall or so forth, inheritance, immediately we're very happy. But then we adjust to that level of happiness, and it no longer brings us the same happiness as it did. And some people have known this for a long time. As Benjamin Franklin said, money has never made men happy, nor will it. There is nothing in its nature to produce happiness. The more of it one has, the more one wants. And that's really the challenge in terms of money. And we adapt very, very quickly to all sorts of new wealth. I can take a question now, or we can wait. Either one. I think I saw a hand, but maybe we'll wait on the question because I might get to it. So if you look at, for example, the phenomenon of cell phones, if you look at these different images, you might remember you might see your very first cell phone pictured. And the reality is that when we first had a cell phone, for many of us, it was very exciting because all of a sudden you could, in fact, call someone from the car, and it was incredible. But the reality is, if I were to take your current phone and give you back your first phone, you might not be very happy, because now we don't expect our phones to let us just call people from the car. We also expect that our phones will let us shoot a movie, buy a dress, read a book, and so on. So in many cases, we see this adaptation very quickly to newfound wealth, which is one of the reasons why money does not seem to consistently make people happy. Now, I want to add one more key point, and this is something really important. For people who are living below the poverty line, for people who are worried about, are my kids going to have enough to eat tomorrow? Do I have a safe place to sleep tonight? Are we going to have enough heat this winter? For people who are worried about survival, more money absolutely brings more happiness. So it's not the case that money never matters, but the key is, once your basic needs are taken care of, more money does not lead to a substantial increase in terms of happiness. Again, because of this power of adaptation. We think we would be happier with a little bit more money. We get a little bit more money, and then we adapt to that level and think, well, if I just had a little bit more, exactly as Benjamin Franklin said. So what else do we think makes us happy but really doesn't? Climate. We actually adjust very quickly to climate, just like we do to more money. If you ask Americans, would you be happier if you lived in California or North Dakota? Can you predict what they say? Virtually everyone says, I would be happier if I lived in California. And that belief actually forms the basis of a joke I tell students. So here's my joke. A patient goes to see a doctor, and the doctor says, I have terrible news. You have 6 months to live. And the patient says, well, that is terrible news. What do you suggest I do? And the doctor says, you should immediately move to North Dakota. And the patient says, well, absolutely, I'll do that right away. And if I move to North Dakota, will I live longer? And the doctor says, no, but it'll feel like forever. Now, let me just say, 3 times I've given that talk in person, in which somebody in the audience then raises their hand and is like, I'm from North Dakota. And they're super offended by this story. North Dakota. But here's what's funny. We're actually wrong. A recent Gallup poll found California, it's not one of the 5 happiest states. Guess what is? North Dakota. So in fact, people in North Dakota are very happy, contrary again to our expectation. So what else do we think makes us happy but really doesn't? Particular life events. Many of us have this expectation of, I will be happy when. And the when changes. It might be when I go to college, when I get a job, when I buy a house, when I get a promotion, when I retire, whatever. We have this expectation that when this thing happens, then I will be happy. So let's take the example of getting a promotion. So you work harder and harder and harder to try to get that promotion. You get this promotion that you're certain is going to bring you lasting happiness. And then all of a sudden it turns out you have to do what? That job, unfortunately. And that job has pressure and deadlines and colleagues, and the permanent happiness you thought was there, it's just not there. Again, we adapt just like we adapt to climate, just like we adapt to more money. But there's one life event that's a little bit interesting, because this life event is in fact associated with happiness for some people. And that's the life event of marriage. So what the research on the science of happiness in marriage tells us is that marriage does consistently make some people happier. And those people are called men. Married men are happier than single men. They're healthier than single men. They live longer than single men. They're less likely to be hospitalized for psychiatric disorders. So overwhelmingly, married men, in fact, do experience higher levels of happiness than single men. And what's even better for the men listening, it doesn't matter who you're married to. Anyone is good. Now, some of the women might be saying, well, how about us? So the data on the science of happiness in marriage for women is actually more complex. What that data shows us is that happily married women are in fact happier and healthier than single women. But unhappily married women are actually less happy and less healthy than single women. So what that data shows us is that for men, marriage is good. But for women, good marriage is good and bad marriage is very bad. So as I tell my students, if you're a man, find someone. But if you're a woman, you got to be picky. You got to find the right someone. And what I like about that finding is that by all accounts, this means that this setup, it might be better for William than for Kate. William, he should be happy. Kate, we hope so. But it's probably a little bit too early to tell. And William's mom, married to a prince, not very happy. I'm going to talk about one more thing that very consistently we have the expectation of this will make us happier. And that is the life event of becoming a parent. This is a little bit of an outdated picture of my 3 kids. So in the picture, they look very quiet. They look very clean. They look very well behaved. But the reality day in and day out of parenting is it's really hard. I gave this talk once in a big hotel ballroom, like 800 people. And I said, the reality day in and day out of parenting. And then I paused and a woman right in the front row yells out, hell. And it echoed like hell, hell, hell over the ballroom. Now, in fairness, that woman had a 2-year-old at home. So the reality day in and day out of parenting is it's really hard. It's playing really boring games with absolutely no strategy. It's doing huge amounts of laundry. It's literally touching somebody else's poop. And as the writer, Annie Lamott says, having a baby is like suddenly getting the world's worst roommate. So here's what the data on signs of happiness in parenthood tells us. Parents do have more highs than non-parents. There's the joy, the peak of the homemade Mother's Day card, or your kid learning to swim or ride a bike or hitting the home run in Little League. Now, these wonderfully sort of special and tender moments, and those peaks are bigger peaks than non-parents experience. But those highs are absolutely coupled with lows of worry and stress and heartache. And those lows are actually lower than non-parents experience. So what does the data on the science of happiness and parenthood tell us? Well, parents have more highs and parents have more lows. And non-parents have a much more even keel existence. Now, sometimes I'll give this talk and a person will email me afterwards and they'll say, but Catherine, you have to remember, if you have children, you might get grandchildren, and grandchildren make me very happy. And what I say to that is, I am really hoping that is true. I'm holding out for that. All right. So far I've talked about what doesn't make us happy, but I want to now turn to the good news. And the good news is there are lots of things that in fact, empirical scientific research tells us does make us happy. So let's start with an easy one. Behaviors. There are many low-level, small behaviors that we can engage in our daily life that scientific evidence shows are empirically associated with greater happiness. So what are these? Well, one of them is eating. But it's not just eating like the act of chewing and swallowing, it's eating particular kinds of foods. What kinds of foods make us happy? Sweets, chocolate, fats, sugar. There's absolutely no evidence for happiness in, say, celery, for example. Now, fortunately, the data is also very strong about the link between happiness and exercise. You all might have heard about the link between exercise and happiness and endorphins. So when we exercise, it actually elevates the level of endorphins, a particular chemical that makes us feel better. And we actually do feel better when we are exercising. Plus, we feel better for a while afterwards. After all, there's almost no better feeling than the feeling of having exercised. And unfortunately, the only way you can get the having exercise feeling, you have to exercise first. It's too bad. Now, we also know very clearly that shopping makes people happy, but it's more interesting than you might think. I want you right now to raise your actual or virtual hand if you have ever found the perfect gift for someone that you care about and experienced a very high level of happiness. Raise your hand if that has ever happened. So look at all those hands right now. So here's what the data tells us. That feeling that most of you have experienced, that feeling of happiness when you're shopping and you find the perfect gift for someone is actually higher than when you're shopping and buying things for yourself. So what this tells us is it's not just shopping like I'm getting things. What really makes us happy is shopping and relationship building. And I'm going to turn and talk about that a little bit later too. So what else makes us happy? Well, personality. I started today's talk by asking who are the kittens and rainbows people and who are not. And the reality is about 50% of our happiness is determined by our genes. And this is why for some people, happiness is easier than for other people. So what is it about personality that predicts happiness? And there are a few distinct things. One, people feel good about themselves. They have high self-esteem. Here's a cartoon that shows the opposite. Dear diary, sorry to bother you again. So people who are high in self-esteem, they feel good about themselves. They also are very good at finding the silver lining no matter what. Freud told a funny story about a couple who came to see him for therapy. And at one point during the course of the therapy session, the husband turned to the wife and said, if one of us were to die, I think I would go live in Paris. Because of course, if it was one of us, it'd be, you would be dead. I have this Paris plan. So the ability to only foresee positive things in your outlook. My oldest son has a remarkable ability for this sort of optimism, no matter what. Andrew started high school a number of years ago now, started high school and really struggled pretty much in all subjects, but he especially struggled in Spanish. And midway through his first trimester, Andrew received a warning grade of a 50 in Spanish. So I was very worried, as you can imagine. But at the end of November, Andrew calls me and he says, Mom, I just got my grades for the end of the first trimester and good news about Spanish. And I said, oh, thank goodness, because I was so worried, what with your 50 at the midway point. And he said, oh yeah, it's good news. And I said, great, what'd you get? And he says, I got a 58. And I said, that is not good news. And he said, no, it's 8 points higher than I had in October. And I said, you got an F in Spanish. And he said, it's really an F plus. And I said, I'm a professor. Like there is no plus on the F. Like that's not a grade. And he said, no, but at the rate I'm going, I'm going to have a 66 in January. And I said, that's a D. Like that also isn't good. But here's the good news about Andrew is that, by all accounts, someday he's probably going to end up in prison and hopefully not a Spanish speaking prison. But he's going to be fine because he's going to call home and say, Mom, I got this bunk bed. I got a roommate. There's this exercise yard. They bring in the meals through the door 3 times a day. It's so relaxing because anyone who can call home with the good news about the F plus, he's going to be happy. He's probably going to be poor and living in my basement, but he's going to be happy. And this ability to find happiness no matter what is tremendously impactful in all different kinds of situations. One of my favorite quotes that really illustrates the power of personality is by Nelson Mandela. I am fundamentally an optimist. Whether that comes from nature or nurture, I cannot say. Part of being optimistic is keeping one's head pointed toward the sun, one's feet moving forward. There were many dark moments when my faith in humanity was sorely tested, but I would not and could not give myself up to despair. That way lays defeat and death. And to me, that's really the perfect illustration of the power of optimism, no matter what. I want to talk about one final factor that is very, very predictive of happiness, and that is the power of relationships. That overwhelmingly, relationships are a consistently strong predictor. In fact, the number one predictor of our happiness. Now, I've talked before about marriage, if you're a man, children for no one, but the reality is relationships do make us happy. They just don't need a particular label. We can be happy if we have good relationships with romantic partners we're not married to. We can be happy if we have good relationships with friends, with neighbors, with family members, with colleagues. What matters isn't the label on the relationship. It's actually the quality of the relationship. And this finding actually is really important in explaining something that psychologists describe as the U-shaped happiness curve. Now, if you look at this U-shaped curve right now, what it shows is happiness across the lifespan. As you can see here, people who are 18 to 21 are in fact quite happy. And then happiness drops like a stone. And this, again, corresponds with what we think about in our society as a midlife crisis. As you can see in this graph, happiness is at the lowest level when you're around 50 to 53. Which is bad news for me. And this, of course, is a time period at which many people have teenagers living in their home, perhaps coincidentally. But then, in what is great news for every single person listening right now, happiness increases in your 50s, in your 60s, in your 70s, and they've studied people up to age 85. And as you can see here, people who are in their 70s and 80s are happier than people who are in the 18 to 21. Now, you might be wondering, well, why? Like what explains that relationship? So they've done qualitative interviews with people across the lifespan. And what they find is very consistent. People in their younger years are very focused on having big social networks, what I like to call Facebook friends. Lots of people, but you're not particularly close to them. People in their 60s and 70s and 80s, they do something very clever. They get rid of the riffraff and they focus on a small number of relationships with people they care about and who care about them. So they basically are choosing quality over quantity. And in fact, what they're doing is perfectly illustrated by this following cartoon. As we grow up, we realize it is less important to have lots of friends and more important to have real ones. And what's also so very important to recognize, particularly in this day and age of technology, is that you build good relationships by having substantive, meaningful conversations with people, with being vulnerable and honest and intimate. And one of the things that disrupts our ability to do so is the presence of cell phones. Who here has ever been somewhere in which you have seen two people who are together, but they are actually each of them on their phone and not really paying attention to each other? Raise your virtual or actual hand if you've ever seen that. Happens all the time, right? We see people in restaurants, we see people in airports, in all different situations. And you can see all these different hands raised. And what happens is you're not then really paying attention to the person that you're with. You're just focusing on the phone. And so what research has shown is that the presence of cell phones can actually disrupt our ability to have the kind of meaningful conversations that help us build good relationships, which are the number one predictor of happiness. All right. I want to talk very briefly now about these different effects, and I want you to do the second poll. So I'm giving you the second poll question, and here it is. So I've talked about a bunch of different findings, and I want you to tell me, which finding did you think was most surprising? Is it that money doesn't predict happiness? Is it that climate doesn't predict happiness? Is it that giving feels better than receiving? Is it that personality matters so much? Or is it that the quality of relationships matters more than the quantity? So I'm just going to give you a second to do that. And let's see. All right, you guys are, again, very fast. I already have 50% of you participating. I will share your responses so you can see how other people rated this. And I'm going to leave lots of time for Q&A, so be thinking about your questions. All right, we're at 60% of people, which is great. I'm going to give it, I want to make sure that I leave lots of time for questions. So I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds. If you want to get your vote in, please do so. All right, we've just hit 70%. So I'm going to count down from 5, and then I am going to shut this poll so that, again, we are going to move on. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I'm going to end the poll. I think we hit 71% of people, and here are the results. So most of you did not find surprising that money doesn't predict happiness. You probably heard that before. But for 42% of you, the power of personality. And that's something I'm going to talk about it again momentarily. So for 42% of you, that was the most surprising. All right. So I want to, again, briefly talk about the power of genes, which in fact is about the power of personality. What we know is that about 50% of our happiness is determined by our genes. And this is probably what explains the link between personality and happiness, is that people's genes may influence whether they are extroverted, whether they are optimistic, whether they are resilient when things, go poorly, and so on. So the power of genes matters a tremendous amount in terms of predicting happiness, again, probably because of personality. And the power of genes also helps us explain why some of the things like the power of like our adaptation to climate or more money don't really matter so much, because again, so much of our happiness is in fact a function of our genes, not our circumstances. As this cartoon illustrates, I could cry when I think of the years I wasted accumulating money only to learn that my cheerful disposition is genetic. And so that's one of the reasons why things like money don't really matter so much. Now, I also want to talk about the power of adaptation. I have talked from the beginning today about the power of adaptation. And what I have said again and again is that the power of adaptation is a bad thing, because you win the lottery and then you just adapt, or you get a raise and you just adapt. You have better climate, you just adapt. You have a better cell phone, you just adapt. So I've talked about the power of adaptation to all of these good events as being a bad thing. But the power of adaptation also is really valuable in terms of predicting happiness, because the power of adaptation also allows us to benefit when difficult things happen. I'm now going to tell you a very, very difficult story. And some of you may remember hearing about this story in the media at some point, depending on where you live. So it's a story about a family living in a small town in Connecticut, the family of Dr. William Pettit, husband, wife, 2 daughters. One night, 2 men who'd recently been released from prison broke into this family's home. They tied the dad up in the basement, and they tied the mom and 2 girls to their beds. They then proceeded to sexually assault all 3 of them. Then, to hide evidence of their crimes, the men set the house on fire. The husband was able to escape from the basement he lived, but the wife and both girls died of smoke inhalation. So most of us hear that story and think, how could he ever be happy again? He's lost his wife, He's lost both of his kids, and he hasn't just lost them. He's lost them in about the most horrific set of circumstances that we can wrap our mind around. And for most of us, it just seems impossible to imagine that he would ever be happy again. And yet, here's the picture of William Pettit from a few years ago. He met a woman who volunteered as a photographer for the foundation that he established to honor his family's memory. Over time, they became friends. Then they fell in love. His first wife's family attended their wedding and said, "We're so happy that you have found someone to share your life with again." And a couple of Decembers ago, they welcomed a little boy. So this doesn't mean that he's the same happy. And it doesn't mean that the tragedy doesn't change and shape and influence his life in fundamental ways and always will. But what this story tells us is it about the power of the human spirit, that even when tremendously difficult things happen, we all have the ability to find happiness again, no matter what. And one of the key findings that I take from the field of positive psychology is that for many of us, happiness involves effort. We have to decide that we want to be happy. We have to decide that we deserve to be happy. And we have to be willing to spend the time and energy and effort to find that happiness that we deserve. As the author Elizabeth Gilbert so eloquently describes, happiness is the consequence of personal effort. You fight for it, strive for it, insist upon it, and sometimes even travel around the world looking for it. You have to participate relentlessly in the manifestations of your own blessings. And once you have achieved a state of happiness, you must never become lax about maintaining it. You must make a mighty effort to keep swimming upward into that happiness forever, to stay afloat on top of it. Now, as promised at the very beginning today, I am now going to give you, in the final moments before we go to Q&A, of which we will do lots, top 10 strategies for increasing happiness. So these are all scientifically valid strategies that you can use to increase happiness. None of them are move to Aruba, sell all your belongings. But most importantly, I'm giving you 10 because different things make different people happy. So for some of you, you might be like, well, this is the thing. And for other people, it might be something different. So I'm giving you 10 because what I'm really hoping is that everyone listening to this talk will find at least one thing that really speaks to them, that really resonates with something that they can use and implement in their lives moving forward. So 1, change your behavior. As I talked about earlier, there are lots of pretty low-level things that we can do that, in fact, can make us feel happier. Getting enough sleep is one. Exercising is one. And so is meditating. So these are all very, very simple things to do. Any kind of exercise counts. You can play golf, you can play tennis, you can do yoga. It doesn't matter what it is, but some kind of exercise matters for many people. Getting enough sleep is good actually for psychological well-being, but also for physical well-being. As was described in the introduction today, my next talk in July is on sleep. So for people who are interested in that, please join in July where I'll talk all about sleep and dreams. Now, does anyone here meditate? Raise your virtual or non-virtual hand if you meditate. Does anyone do that? I'm seeing a few hands. Oh, great, great. So what the research on meditation shows is really, really profound, that meditation seems to be very beneficial in terms of psychological well-being as well as physical well-being. And there's fascinating research looking at patterns of brain activity that actually shows that meditating seems to change parts of your brain, even in ways that make you kinder and nicer to other people. So feel free to ask me if you have questions about that at the end. So 1 strategy, change your behavior. 2, find your match. And this is true both in your personal life, in your professional life. Again, it could be in volunteer work, in your community, and so on. As Steve Jobs said, the only way to do great work is to love what you do. And here is what is particularly fascinating about the research on this topic, that people vary tremendously on what makes them happy in terms of what is their right match. There is a scale in psychology, it's called the sensation-seeking scale. And basically what the scale measures is the extent to which you like the feeling of high levels of physiological arousal, like your heart beating fast, rapid breathing, etc. I have this picture because basically some people think it'd be really fun to bungee jump or parachute out of an airplane. And some people are like, I would never do that. So there is a perfect illustration that for some people, this is like, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. Let's do a quick show of hands. Who here, raise your hand if you think it would be really fun to bungee jump or parachute out of an airplane. Raise your hands. I'll give you a second there. We're going to see some hands. All right, and let's put your hands down. And now let's raise your hand if you're one of the smart people who thinks that's a bad idea. All right, anyway, so again, so there is an example in which even on this call, you can see that people vary tremendously. And so here's what's important. Figure out which person you are. Because for some people, high levels of physiological arousal feel great. And for some people, they do not. And so this is, again, an example of how different settings make people happy. Another sort of classic example of this effect is for some people, camping is exciting. Camping is exciting and it's fun. And how's it going to turn out? And I'm in the wilderness, et cetera. For other people, camping is not fun. If they go on vacation, they want a luxury hotel. As I say to my husband, your camping wife is your second wife. It's not this one. So again, figuring out what makes you happy is very individual. And so finding your match, what appeals to you. 3, spend time in nature. And this is one of the most consistent findings in terms of the benefits of nature. One of the earliest studies that looked at this actually looked at recovery from surgery. And what they did in this study was they compared rates of recovery for patients who'd had the exact same surgery, but some of them had been assigned to a room that overlooked a lovely park. So they saw like trees and flowers and grass. And some of them had been assigned to a room that overlooked a parking lot. So they saw like asphalt and cars. And what they found was that patients who'd been assigned to the room overlooking the park got out of bed faster, had better reports from the nurses, needed lower levels of pain medication, and got discharged faster from the hospital. So even just looking at nature out a window was actually beneficial in terms of recovery from surgery. A more recent study looked at patterns of fMRI data. So again, patterns of brain activity. They brought in people and they showed them the 2 pictures that I have on the bottom of your screen right now. So as you can see, these are both visually appealing pictures, but they're really different. One of them is of an urban city skyline. One of them is of a rural nature scene. And what they found is that when people are looking at the rural nature scene, their brain is calm and relaxed, like they're meditating or sleeping. When they're looking at the urban city skyline, the brain is active, it's firing. So what that study tells us is that even just looking at a picture of nature seems to be relaxing physiologically for the body. And it doesn't have to be, again, spending time in a completely remote nature environment. Very simple studies have found that people who are in an urban environment, but spending time in a green space, so walking through a park, for example, also experience benefits. So this spending time in nature does not have to be, I'm going to move to Wyoming or whatever. Spending time in nature can be making a point of spending time outside in nature, even if you live in a more urban environment. And as I just said, spending time in nature is good for happiness and also health. Express gratitude. So there's this wonderful quote by Dale Carnegie. One of the most tragic things I know about human nature is that all of us tend to put off living. We are all dreaming of some magical rose garden over the horizon instead of enjoying the roses that are blooming outside our windows today. And that's really the key finding, that people who focus on what they are grateful for, not what they are grateful for when I buy a house, when I retire, when I win the lottery, whatever. People who express gratitude for what they have in their moment, at their life right now, experience higher levels of happiness. So focusing again on gratitude is extraordinarily important. This is one of my favorites, make a gratitude visit. And this idea comes from a professor at the University of Pennsylvania named Martin Seligman. And what he has people do is to think about someone who has played a fundamental role in changing and shaping their lives in some valuable way. Could be a teacher, could be a mentor, could be a boss, could be a neighbor, it doesn't matter who it is. But you think about that person and then you write them a letter. And then you travel to them and you stand in front of them and read the letter aloud. And that, of course, is a tremendously positive experience for the person who's reading the letter and a tremendously positive experience for the person who's hearing the letter. And what I love about that example is it's something that too few of us do, that we often wait and tell people what they've meant to us in a eulogy when they've died. And so this is an example of sharing what people have meant to us far before the time of their passing. 6, smile, even when you aren't happy. This is the kind of fake it till you make it idea. A very clever study brought in people and they had them hold chopsticks in their teeth in one of 3 facial expressions. So they told people what facial expression to hold. They had to hold chopsticks in their teeth. And then while they were holding this expression, they put their hand in a bucket of freezing cold ice water. And they said, keep your hand in as long as you can. And when you can't stand it anymore, pull your hand out. And what they found was that people holding the big beaming smile kept their hand in the bucket of ice water significantly longer. And so what this study tells us is that the mere act of smiling actually changes how our body responds to pain. It's also the case that when you smile, people probably respond to you with a smile. So it creates this reciprocal feeling of happiness. Give anything to anyone. The research is very clear on this point. People who volunteer in their community, higher levels of happiness. People who donate to charity, higher levels of happiness. Every color on this map that's in green, there is a positive correlation between charitable giving and happiness, meaning that giving actually does make people happier. Fascinating research looking again at patterns of brain activation has found that when you just think about giving a gift to a friend, it activates a part of the brain that is the exact same part of the brain that is activated when you eat chocolate, suggesting that just giving to other people, even a stranger, makes us feel happy. It's rewarding. 8, spend money wisely. Now, I started today by saying money doesn't make you happy, don't worry about it. But the reality is you can spend money in better or worse ways. So what's the best way to spend money? On experiences. Could be travel, could be tickets to the big game or a concert or a play, something that is an experience, a spa day, anything. What's not a good way to spend money? Belongings, expensive watch, car, shoes, purse. Initially, it's exciting. And then you just adapt, just like you adapt to more money. As this cartoon illustrates very clearly, what no one says on their deathbed is, I should have bought more crap. No one is thinking that. And as for philosopher Roger Corliss says, trying to be happy by accumulating possessions is like trying to satisfy hunger by taping sandwiches all over your body. Just does not make you happy. 9, avoid comparisons. Many people feel perfectly happy right up until when they start comparing their lives to those around them. As this cartoon says, I do count my blessings, but then I end up counting those of others who have more and better blessings. And that pisses me off. Or as Teddy Roosevelt said, comparison is the thief of joy. And this is one of the reasons why lots and lots of scientific research suggests that people who spend more time on social media, or what I like to call fake book, actually experience lower levels of happiness. Because when you're on social media, everybody posts about the good. You know, my kid is valedictorian, and here's this great trip that I took with my family, and we loved each other the whole time. And I just ran the Boston Marathon in under 3 hours again. And so when you're on social media, people often start doing this comparison, and that makes them feel worse about their own lives. And finally, last but not least, and I give this one last because it's the most important, and that is build and maintain good relationships. Number 1 best predictor of happiness, as I talked about before. But here's the challenge. You only get those relationships by spending time and energy and effort. It involves conflict and compromise. I love this picture, which illustrates a dancer on point and then her feet without the shoe. And I think this is a wonderful metaphor for relationships. From a distance, relationships look easy and magical and simple. But the reality is that building good relationships takes time and energy and effort and conflict and compromise. And my final quote for you today perfectly illustrates this, and it's by Tolstoy. But on entering upon family life, he saw at every step that it was utterly different from what he had imagined. At every step, he experienced what a man would experience who, after admiring the smooth, happy course of a little boat on a lake, should get himself into that little boat. He saw that it was not all sitting still, floating smoothly, that one had to think to, not for an instant to forget where one was floating, and that there was water under one, and that one must row, and that his unaccustomed hands would be sore, and that it was only to look at it that was easy, but that doing it, though very delightful, was very difficult. And to me, that's really a perfect illustration of what the research on the science of happiness tells us. Relationships are the single best predictor of happiness, but you got to expend time and energy and effort to have those relationships. And I want to now turn to my final poll question for today before we turn it over to Q&A. And for this poll question, unlike the others, you can answer more than one choice. So which strategies that I've described do you find most helpful? Remember to scroll down to the bottom because some of the strategies are hidden at the bottom. And I'll just give you about a minute or so to share your thoughts. And then I will, of course, reveal it. All right, and over 30% of you have already participated. Oh, now just 40. And now just 50%. So this is great. And now 60%. Okay. You guys are very fast. Now we're over 70% already. So I think I'm going to give it just about 5 more seconds. And then I will share your answers. I'm always intrigued to see what people will say. So if you want to get your answer in, I'm going to count us down to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we just hit 82% of people. So I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share your responses. So here are the responses. And so I'm going to just kind of pick out the highlights. And so for 52% of you, it was spend time in nature. For 54%, it was express gratitude. And for 58%, it was build and maintain close relationships. And lots of others people also reported high levels about. So I now want to end by sharing one final picture, which is a picture of my dog. And I share a dog because overwhelmingly, if I don't talk about pets, I'm going to get that as my number one question. So what does the research show on the science of pets? Overwhelmingly, the data is very strong that pets, in fact, are beneficial for happiness. My husband and I have been married for 27 years. We have the 3 kids. You saw that picture earlier. We have this lovely dog. And we have the following deal. If one of us leaves the other one, the one who leaves takes the 3 kids. And the other one gets this lovely dog. And that has kept our relationship very strong and very committed. I gave this talk. Oh, this is my last story. I gave this talk a couple of years ago in Dallas. And at the end of my talk, a man came up and he said, I have the perfect illustration of your pet finding. So this is my final joke. He says, and this is, again, I'm telling the story from the man. Imagine you come home from work one day and you put your wife and your dog in the trunk of your car and you drive around for an hour. At the end of the hour, when you open up the trunk, guess who's still happy to see you? Then that man told me he was divorced. And I'm like, really? I can't imagine why. Anyway, so you guys have been a wonderful audience. I'm going to turn it over now to Q&A. If anyone wants to, this was being recorded, so you can watch it. You're going to get sent this. I've already sent Ashley my slides, so I think you're going to get my slides probably like immediately. But if you are watching this later as a recording and you have a question that you want to ask me, you can just send me an email. My email is right there. And a lot of the research that I talked about today is from my book. So if anyone really is nerdy and into the kind of the science that I described, you can check that out anywhere. I'm going to stop screen sharing so we can see each other a little bit more, but I will put my email address and my website address in the chat room so you can look at that if you want to.